These days, video game box art around the world is pretty similar no matter what region a game is released in. Sure, occasionally some regions may get arguably better art, and in some cases, better titles, but for the most part, the art on a game's cover is very similar if not identical anywhere you look. This, however, was not always the case. Back in the olden days of the NES, SNES, and even the PS1, video game box art in America tended to be heavily changed from the art style a game was intended to have, more often with Japanese games. A lot of Japanese games tend to have a very anime-inspired art style on their covers, especially back in the day when realistic graphics really weren't a possibility. And while the PlayStation Vita library is proof that this is no longer an issue, back then, anime-inspired art was pretty much nowhere to be seen when Japanese games were brought overseas. For every Gonbare Goemon, there was a Legend of the Mystical Ninja. For every Kaiketsu Yanchamaru, there was a Kid Nikki Radical Ninja. Why was this even a thing back then? One could only guess it had to do with game publishers and marketers being too afraid to put this kind of art style on store shelves in a time when video games were still an emerging and niche form of entertainment. I mean, this was a time when video games were marketed almost exclusively to young boys, and young boys were into G.I. Joe, guns, swords, muscles, and women in revealing clothes. Nowadays, well, at least Japanese games still have that last one covered, which can also be proven by the Vita library. So today we're looking at just how alarmingly different localized box art was from its superior Japanese counterparts. I hope you like looking at pictures. Let's start off with probably one of the most famous examples, Mega Man. You know him, you love him, but would you really have bought the game back in the day if your first impression of him was this? I wouldn't have. The Japanese version very clearly shows that this is Mega Man, or Rockman as he's known in Japan. Not only that, but you get a peek at the Robot Masters and it's like, yeah, okay, this looks cool, I could be into this. The American version is like, I mean, let's not even think about how this doesn't look like Mega Man. The art itself just looks bad. It looks like something I would have gotten a C on in my high school art class. Maybe a C+. Clearly, this Rockman design is an obvious representation of the sprite you see when you play the game. Blue suit, big eyes, but this? Where did this come from? Where's the yellow? Where's the handgun? Nowhere. Next up, we have Breath of Fire. For the uninformed, Breath of Fire is a series of Japanese role-playing games, and the original box art represents that very well. But not in the US. No, in the US we got this, which is at least well done, but it's just so vastly different from what the game is. This looks closer to a 90s X-Men comic than it does the characters in the game. The first game was published by Squaresoft, but when Capcom took over for the sequel, they must have thought the comic book art style was still a good idea. At least they finally learned their lesson with Breath of Fire 4. Staying within the JRPG area for a few more games, next up we have the Dragon Quest series. Dragon Quest, like Chrono Trigger, has always had artwork done by Akira Toriyama, the creator of the Dragon Ball franchise. Here on the Japanese box for the first game, we see the protagonist fighting a big dragon in a very clear, classic Toriyama style. In the US, we got something very different. But at least the theme is the same. You got the guy with the horn helmet fighting a big dragon, though it does follow a very 80s fantasy-inspired art style, much like you'd see on the side of the van that your uncle hangs out in when he smokes his funny cigarettes. The next two games in the series followed a similar theme. While the Japanese versions showed characters from the game, the second game showed art that could have come from any D&D book, and the third game was like, just throw some treasure on there, it's good enough. Next, things get a bit confusing with Final Fantasy IV and VI, or as they were known when they came to the States, Final Fantasy II and III. That must have been really confusing when the next game we got here was actually called Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy II here had a very similar cover to Final Fantasy I. But in Japan, Final Fantasy IV had these chibi characters, inspired by the in-game sprites that had been a series staple since the original game. And then on to Final Fantasy VI. We have this beautiful piece of art made by Yoshitaka Amano, who at this point had already been creating art for the Final Fantasy series for years. While not representative of actual in-game graphics, good box art doesn't have to be. But it should make sense as far as representing what the characters look like, or representing elements of the actual game. Here we see Terra, riding in Magitech armor, looking over a cityscape, I guess. I haven't played 6 yet. In America, our version, which remember here was called Final Fantasy III, we got a Moogle. Well, I mean, yeah, Moogles are in Final Fantasy games. The last JRPG I have for you is Lufia. Great game from what I've heard, but, I mean, just look at these guys. Not terrible, but not appealing in my opinion. Known as Estpolis in Japan, the art is fitting for the game, and in my opinion, kinda looks like a ripoff of the art from Final Fantasy IV. The characters on the cover of Lufia just look like a bunch of characters from Deke cartoons. You know.
Deke.
Like Mummies Alive, or I don't know, The Littles? Up next we have Street Fighter. The original Street Fighter to be exact. The first game was primarily in arcades and didn't really get a big home release like Street Fighter 2 did, but it did get some. In Japan, it was actually released on the PC Engine under the name Fighting Street for some reason. And this character, I guess, was supposed to be Ryu. At least that game's version of Ryu. Here we got some PC releases of Street Fighter, but, well, they are in a street, and they do appear as though they're about to partake in a round of fisticuffs. Especially that guy. Most of these games have been pretty old, but this last example is much more recent. Back when the Kirby franchise was new, the box art here was a bit different from Japan, but not bad. And it did look like Kirby. I mean, there isn't really much you can do to make this pink puffball of wonders look tough. But that doesn't mean we didn't try! The box art changes I want to talk about are much more subtle and actually as recent as the GameCube and the DS. Kirby, as we can all tell, is very cute, as is evident by looking at him. And in Japan, Nintendo embraces that cuteness. It's actually part of what people love about Kirby. Well, the cuteness is apparently just a bit too much for Nintendo of America, because here, they've altered the Kirby box art just a bit to take the edge off. Do you see it? Wait for it. It's eyebrows. They gave him eyebrows. They gave him angry eyebrows. Yes, Nintendo of America's mentality with Kirby for a while was, little boys aren't gonna buy a game with a cute pink ball for a main character. Just make him look mad. Now he's not cute, he's out for blood. This did happen for a little while, but to their credit, Nintendo hasn't really been doing this anymore with more recent releases. But to me, the subtle, almost petty change is funny, and it's even spawned some hilarious memes. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to see more, feel free to check out one of these other videos you see here on the screen, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You can also follow me by looking up The Portly Gamer on the social networks below.